Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host. And before we even get into tonight's material, since we're going to talk about pretty much exclusively Microsoft technologies on tonight's show, we should mention, as we always do, Andy and I both work for Microsoft. We're in our security business in the field sales of our security solutions. So although we're not involved in development of these products we're talking about, we are definitely involved in representing them and selling them. So, they say, talk about what you know. And Andy and I know quite a bit about this. So we thought we'll continue with our cloud security series. So Andy, what are we talking about tonight?
Yeah, so in the spirit of cloud security, I wanted to hit the topics that I think would be most beneficial for the swath of folks who are in infrastructure and cloud. And so we talked about Defender for Servers in a previous episode. We talked about cloud security posture management, which are both two big things when it comes to cloud security. And continuing that series, I thought, what is the next thing that I think a lot of people would benefit from? And that, I believe, is storage. Now,
agree.
Storage is, multiple different ways. We're not really talking about databases yet because there's a whole nother Defender for SQL. But when we talk about storage, we really mean Azure Blob Storage, Azure Files, and Azure Data Lake Storage. And so those are the three. And then we will cross over into some of the multi-cloud capabilities of Defender for Storage in some of the Amazon S3 buckets and Google Cloud Storage. But for the most part, at least to start off with, we're going to be talking about the core capabilities of Defender for Storage, which is an Azure native security solution that uses security intelligence from our threat intelligence feeds and other things to detect potential threats within those three things that we mainly talked about here, which is the blob storage, the files, and the Azure Data Lake Storage. There are three major impacts on your data workload, which we will go into and how we protect it. But the three impacts are mainly malicious file uploads, sensitive data exfiltration, and data corruption. And that also goes along with activity monitoring. Last year, in March of 2023, a new Defender for Storage plan was launched that included additional features like sensitive data threat scanning and malware scanning. But it also includes the activity monitoring, which is part of that classic plan, but it has been enhanced with some capabilities, which we'll talk about. And if you are on the classic plan, there's documentation on how to migrate, which we'll include in the documentation, and how to take advantage of these new features. But there is a little bit of support still. I think it's 3 years from when the new plan was announced until when the old plan, the classic plan, will be deprecated. So you have a little bit of time, but definitely want to migrate that as soon as possible.
Yeah, you're coming up on about halfway point, if not already. So about 18 months-ish to go.
So a few of the protections when we talk about Defender for Storage, especially with this new plan, there's better malware protection against malicious uploads. So the scanning that is included, when it comes to pricing, I might leave it to Adam to talk a little bit about the pricing, but the malware scanning is actually an add-on, so it's actually not included in the base plan, but it is something that is an additional capability that we've added.
And let's just add that context real quick so listeners have that as they're going through it. So I am not familiar with exactly how this is priced off the top of my head, but what I can share with you is, like all the other Defender for Cloud solutions, this is a consumption-based service, which means the more you use it, the more you pay. And there's different pricing for, like Andy talked about, the kind of core functionality and then the additional malware scanning. Those are two separate components and they have kind of a different metering model to them. A really good resource, if you've never looked at it before, is the Azure pricing calculator. You can just do a web search for it. It'll take you there. And one pro tip is actually sign in with your corporate identity. If you already have any additional Azure discounts or anything like that with your corporate account, those will be reflected in the pricing. But that lets you go in there and start just throwing numbers around and seeing how that impacts what you may be charged. But so the good news is there's nothing to buy up front. There's no licenses to go procure, and there's no long-term commitment. You can turn this on. You could use it for a little bit, say this doesn't meet my needs. You could turn it back off. So no long-term commitment, pay as you go, and then you basically pay for how much you use. So it's a really fair pricing model that's equally applied. If your org is not as big as another one or not using as much in things like Azure Blob Storage or Azure Files, you'll pay less. So check out the Azure pricing calculator for more details, but that gives you at least a concept of these aren't licenses you have to go buy up front.
Thanks for that, Adam. So there's also some improved detections that we talked about on the protection of sensitive data. And that will help you identify any type of data that is at risk. It'll help you identify what's the most significant and most sensitive data that you have stored there, and also if that data is getting accessed or exfiltrated. There's some other things like detection of entities without identities. So Defender for Storage can detect suspicious activities that are generated by entities without identities that are accessing your data using misconfigured or overly permissioned shared access signatures or SAS tokens that might have been leaked or compromised, so you can reduce the risk of unauthorized access. That is one of the expanded capabilities of that activity monitoring that I talked about from the classic to the new plan. And since there's no agent to deploy for Defender for Storage, it's really easy to scale up on all of your different storage accounts. And so you can turn this on at the resource level, but it is recommended that you turn it on at the subscription level. So there's a couple of different ways to deploy it, but just for the most part, we recommend turning it on at the subscription level to cover all of your accounts that are within the subscription. And then you can also automate it so that, once you've enabled it, any other storage accounts that come on within that subscription can then automatically get onboarded into Defender for Storage.
Great call out there. I love that capability to where if you set as an organizational standard that we will run malware scanning against all of our cloud infrastructure file storage or blob storage, you can enable this at at a subscription level, and then everything inherits it automatically. For security folks listening or watching our show, I know that's a challenge you constantly go through, is ensuring that your policies are actually being applied and leveraged in the real world. And this helps you sleep better at night knowing that's turned on across the board. So when you think of the different acronyms you may associate with cloud security, you may hear things like CSPM or CNAP or CWPP. This is really what we're talking about, is the CWPP part of it, the Cloud Workload Protection Platform. This is workload level protection, and it's native to Azure. So there's nothing you really have to deploy. You flip a switch, and all of your storage accounts that are associated under that subscription are now protected, now and in the future.
So the three main areas that we're going to talk about here, as far as the type of threats that we can protect against. Number one, activity monitoring, which is core to both the basic plan and the new enhanced plan. Defender for Storage is continuously analyzing data and the control plane logs of the protected storage accounts when you turn this on. So there's no need to turn on resource logs for each resource for the security benefits. And that is really good because the resource logs can be very verbose. Every time someone's accessing something, if you're logging that, then that can be, additional storage that you have to pay for. So we're going to be monitoring the control plane rather than having to do it at the resource level. And it uses the Microsoft Threat Intelligence to identify any type of suspicious signatures like malicious IP addresses, Tor exit nodes, and any potential dangerous applications that are accessing it. And then it builds data models using statistical and machine learning methods to spot baseline activity anomalies, which might indicate malicious behavior. And then you're going to receive these alerts for suspicious activity within your Defender for Cloud activity alerts, which then, of course, you can connect to Sentinel or other SIM to monitor. And the activity monitoring, it won't affect the performance or ingestion capabilities or any access to your data. So all going to be pretty seamless, and you're not going to notice any performance hit.
That's all fantastic. And really, when you're evaluating different solutions, and this is a competitive space, I know Palo Alto does some of this and Wiz does some of this. One of the reasons you look at Microsoft for these solutions really is that threat intelligence that Andy talked about. Microsoft now, this number goes up all the time, Andy. I forget what the current one is. It's something like 72 trillion signals a month or something like that. If you annualize it, it becomes like a quadrillion or something crazy. So it's a crazy big number. But one thing Microsoft's really good at, because of the scope and scale, is being able to detect those proverbial needles in the haystack, being able to see the signal from the noise. When you have a lot of signal, you have a better ability to determine what is noise and what is relevant. And so giving you these actionable alerts to say, hey, we're seeing some anomalous behavior with your storage account. You should go check it out. Those are going to be really high fidelity, really strong alerts, because we just have the ability to determine, like, okay, this is actually pretty normal. This is standard noise versus this really stands out above the noise.
When it comes to the malware scanning capabilities, anything that is getting uploaded in near real time is going to get scanned. And we're not just talking about hash reputation here. We're talking about a comprehensive analysis, full scan of the contents of that file, and then returning back a result of whether it's good or not. Now, if you aren't using the malware scanning, like I said, it's kind of an add-on for this particular solution. Hash reputation is built in. So hash reputation is just part of it. You're going to get that. And that's just, based on our threat intelligence, whether this hash is deemed to be malicious or not, or suspicious based on all the intelligence data that we have. But if you're doing malware scanning, it's going to do a full analysis of the contents of that file, executed in a sandbox if needed, and so on and so forth. So that's going to give you probably the best solution. And again, that is agentless, so it allows you to scale up with any with zero maintenance, and allows you to automate any type of response at scale for these.
I was going to ask you about that. So previously, I think this solution was hash reputation only. And this enhanced malware scanning was added on. And because it's computationally expensive, as opposed to raising the price for everyone, it became an add-on solution for customers that need it, who need that extra layer of, I want every single file scanned every time. Well, here you go. That's computationally expensive for us to run, but we'll happily do it for you. We just need you to share in the costs of doing that, of course. So that makes a ton of sense now that you kind of walk through that. And again, you may not need that. That may not be appropriate for every storage account every time, depending on what kind of work you're doing. But certainly you can think of a lot of scenarios where absolutely I want to scan stuff for 0 days, where with reputation, there's a little bit of a delay where other people have to see something funny is going on before the reputation changes. Now, again, I think we can do that at scale faster than just about anyone, because we're learning from reputation and things like email security, endpoint security, as well as cloud security. But still, the first time you see something that's truly polymorphic or truly new and novel, it's going to be harder to pick up on that. So if you need the confidence that we can pick that up the first time, that's where you go with this.
Now, this last one that I want to talk to you about is sensitive data threat detection. And this is really where Microsoft is going to shine, because when it comes to accessing things from a malicious IP or Tor exit nodes, malware scanning, that stuff is pretty baseline security when it comes to any type of storage account. And I believe that if you went to Amazon and AWS and you looked at their native solution, they have something very similar. I'm sure Google Cloud has the same thing. But when it comes to the actual data, the sensitive data detection, this is really where when you start using all of Microsoft's solutions, it's really going to start to shine, because what it does is it enables security teams to like look at security alerts of sensitive data that could be at risk, and it uses a sensitive data discovery engine that's agentless, and it takes a smart sampling of the resources within your storage accounts, and it's integrated with Microsoft Purview sensitive information types classification labels, and allows that seamless inheritance of your organization's sensitivity settings. So if you've already done the work in sensitivity, data discovery, data classification, and then, use those sensitivity labels to already start to classify your structured data, that work is going to flow over into these storage accounts using Defender for Storage. So I want to mention, in September of 2023, we announced that this capability for sensitive data discovery is compatible with AWS S3 buckets as well as Google Cloud Storage buckets. So if you've onboarded those AWS accounts or GCP projects into your subscriptions with Defender for Cloud and enabled Defender for Storage on those and CSPM, then that sensitive data discovery using those Purview sensitive information types and labels will also flow over to AWS.
Very cool. And one thing I see us try to do pretty consistently across our solutions is not just generate a ton of alerts for alert generation's sake, but prioritize those alerts and using any signal you can to help guide security teams to here's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. And integrating with Microsoft Purview and its sensitive information types is really helpful. If you have done that work, like Andy said, and you've labeled stuff confidential, highly confidential, and we see alerts that involve that data, we're going to push those to the top of the list. Hey, this is way more important to take a look at than someone messing with some of your files that are just cat memes. Like, it's really an extra benefit. And to be fair, a lot of organizations are finally doing this work in large part because of Microsoft 365 Copilot. That has been a driver for organizations that had talked about doing this forever to finally get on board with Microsoft Purview and do that sensitive information types and do those sensitivity labels and all that work. I'm seeing more orgs do that than ever. So your org may have finally done this work, and now you can benefit from it in other ways like this. This is how expansive it is. And Andy's point was, hey, great threat intelligence is one thing, but delivering security as a platform enables these kinds of experiences as well. And that's really, really valuable. Again, for our listeners who are security defenders, what we want to know is, hey, are you guiding me to the most impactful alerts so I can make the biggest difference for my organization? And here's a tool that's trying to use those signals to help you do that. And then one final thought here before we move on. A lot of people think about Microsoft Purview information protection as really strictly limited to unstructured data, files in OneDrive and in SharePoint and floating around Microsoft 365 and sitting on your PC. There are now Purview solutions for structured data types as well, and that extend into Azure infrastructure in a variety of ways. So this is truly becoming not just a thing you run for your clients and your email and your SharePoint, but holistic end-to-end for all of your data inside your organization. And now here's where, when we're storing it, we can help generate better alerts as a result.
When it comes to enabling Defender for Storage, it's pretty straightforward. You're going to see your subscriptions within Azure. If you've onboarded any AWS accounts or GCP projects, you're going to see them within there. And the easiest way is just to go into the Azure portal and toggle it on.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other ways to do it. If you're kind of, command line geek, you can do it as infrastructure as code. There's a REST API that you can use. And then there's also Azure Policy. Azure Policy is probably one of the more underutilized things that I've seen in most organizations.
We need to do a show on it.
Yeah. If you're not familiar with it, it's definitely something to take a look at, because it's kind of like, in a crude comparison, it's kind of like GPO, but for like Azure. And, one of the things that I think is a big nightmare for a lot of CISOs is having a publicly accessible storage account, like an Azure Blob Storage, an S3 bucket that's publicly accessible. And all of a sudden your data is exposed. Well, you can obviously, with Defender for Storage, you can get those alerts, right? To tell you, hey, there's a public IP address that's assigned to this. It's publicly accessible. But also with policy, you can just say you're not allowed to create an Azure Blob Storage with a public IP address. You're not allowed to create a VM with a public IP address. So it just, by policy, when someone tries to do it, which is, I think a lot of organizations have a subscription, maybe like they give it to the developer group and they say you can go ahead and use this much money and go ahead and spin up as many VMs. But how do you know that they're not going to put public IP addresses and open up RDP and SSH to the internet, right? You can block it by policy. It's one of the easiest things that you can do. So, maybe we should do a show on Azure Policy, because that's actually a really good topic that we haven't dived into for cloud security. So,
yeah, I want to learn more about it. I know conceptually, like what you just described, Andy, and that's about the extent of my knowledge, but I think it would be great. So yeah, let's put that on the docket for the future.
Yeah. So, when it comes to configuring it, if you do choose for that malware scanning, there are advanced configurations for that, as well as if you do want the results logged, you have to store the results within a workspace. And then if you want automated responses, you have to configure that. So you would spin up a logic app, and there's documentation on how to walk through all of that within the Defender for Storage deployment section.
Logic apps are really cool, actually, and they're incredibly inexpensive. You can build logic apps with pretty much a GUI interface. It's kind of drag and drop. It's really the back end of like Power Automate, if you're familiar with that, what used to be called Microsoft Flow. So it's really simple to kind of understand. It's basically kind of an if this then that kind of model. And we use this a lot inside of Microsoft. So our DSRE team, essentially the security operations team, they will use this. Like if you get flagged doing something naughty, like you ran Mimikatz on your workstation, or you did something else maybe you shouldn't have, it actually uses a lot of logic apps to like send you an email and say like, hey, did you run Mimikatz on your endpoint? If yes, click this button, and we will mark this as, that you did it, and we'll close the ticket and move on. If you don't respond in 15 minutes, we're going to isolate your PC and email your manager and do all these things. So they build these logic apps that kind of handle a lot of this really basic workflow of maybe how your security analyst would address this if it came up. So if you want to build something similar here, where it's like, hey, let's build a logic app that if something gets flagged in a storage account, let's email the storage account owner. Let's give them X amount of time to respond. If they don't, then we can escalate it or generate an alert or whatever. So don't sleep on that. It's literally like pennies, like fractions of a penny per run through a logic app. So you can build a logic app on top of this for literally like pennies, if not like a couple bucks a month to run, and really help streamline things for your security operations team. So don't sleep on logic apps integration. I know a lot of people kind of get into like, oh boy, I don't know how to write code, or I'm not really good at that. I'm not comfortable with that. Like this is graphical user interface to build workflows. And if you can help, again, take more off your plate, I'm preaching to the choir here, but any security operations team could use more time in their day. So if we can automate some of these more common responses we would take to an alert, let's do that.
And finally, in the documentation after you deploy, it has 3 great examples on how to test whether or not your monitoring is good. So for malware, it walks you through how to upload an EICAR test file and to see if it's working. For data security, it tells you how to create a sensitivity, or a sensitive data file, like, put your social security number or something, or a fake social security number in the file, and to see if your threat detection is working there. And then for activity monitoring, it has you testing, uploading or downloading a file from a Tor browser to generate a security alert. So, if you have other tools that will detect you accessing stuff from a Tor browser, maybe not access it from your work computer.
Yeah, speaking of things that generate an alert from DSRE, Tor browser is one of them.
Yes. Yeah, so I would definitely not do that on my work computer,
Mhm.
but there are definitely ways to test whether or not it's working or not. So that's all in the documentation. But overall, I think this is a pretty straightforward security solution. If you have Azure storage, Amazon S3 buckets, Google Cloud storage accounts, this is something that you do need some protections around. So make sure, if it's not Microsoft solution, make sure you have something to protect, especially the sensitive data, accessing it, activity monitoring, malware scanning, all of those things.
Yeah, this is great. And hey, one final note I thought of while we were talking about it. If this is something you're interested in and you start to look at this and say, hey, well, there's these other workloads I'd like to turn on too. And, maybe I'd like to do some CSPM as well. If you're starting to look at this and say, hey, maybe this is a broader effort we should do inside of our organization, know that there's something called a pre-purchase plan available now for Defender for Cloud workloads. And this is where you can make kind of an upfront purchase and get a programmatic discount on all of these services too. So you commit to, hey, I know we're going to spend at least this if we turn all this on. So we'll commit to that. We'll pay that up front, and then we'll get like 15% off or whatever. And then it's like credits we can burn down over the course of the year. So there's some options there as well. If this is interesting, talk to your Microsoft account team about things like the pre-purchase plan, ways to make this a little more affordable or even predictable in how you're going to be billed for it as well. If you have a team that would much rather kind of pay up front and have it budgeted and know than just have the meter spin and get a bill every month, that's an option as well. That can maybe make everyone sleep a little better at night. So there's options. If you look at this and you say, this is cool, we want to do this, but that model is challenging, there's ways to help improve it.
Well, great. That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening as always. Our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJBrewer. See you at our next episode.